So today we're talking about pins and bushings, bearings, how much grease needs to go in each fitting. First thing you gotta be able to do is identify what you're greasing. Is it a pin and a bushing? Is it a bearing? And how does that reflect on what kind of grease you should be using? So typically a pin and a bushing is gonna be on parts that are slow moving and bigger in size. Not always the case, but often. So like pivot points on the loader of a skid steer, on the loader of a tractor, or different things like that. On tillage equipment, a lot of times you have pins and bushings. On bulldozers, backhoes, excavators, most of those pivot points are going to be a pin and a bushing. And a pin and a bushing is two machined surfaces that slide together. So the pin goes into the bushing, it's a very tight fit, and grease gets in there and provides the lubrication that's needed. Typically grease in a bushing is going to be tackier, a little bit heavier, so it holds in place, it doesn't get pressed out. Whereas in a bearing, the grease is going to be a little bit butterier in texture, and so that it works around that whole surface of the bearing on the inside. And it doesn't create resistance or drag. So a really tacky grease can actually limit the speed of a high-speed bearing. So we want something that's either a mix of the both for like a multi-purpose grease, or using a tackier grease on pins and bushings, and a buttery grease on bearings, typically. So a bushing is designed to take grease, and the grease is a benefit in two ways. One, it provides the lubricating properties, and two, you create a grease seal that prevents water and other debris, dirt, whatever, dust, from getting in the pin and bushing and creating excess wear. So right here we have a pin and a bushing, right? So we can grease that. And sometimes you can hear it when the grease starts to come out of the fitting, or you can sometimes see, depending on how the bushing's made, that a little bit of grease is starting to come out around the outside. And so if we give this one a little bit more, so I can actually hear it coming out, and so we know that that one's good. We don't have to put more grease on there. And so what that excess grease around the outside, and it would be in this case around that edge, it's going to prevent dirt and water from getting into that pin or bushing. So you can grease a pin and a bushing typically until you start to see or hear grease come out of that fitting, around that surface. A bearing on the other side of that is going to be a lot different. So a bearing is enclosed, and on this bearing here, we've got it painted in red. That's a seal. And so the seal already prevents dirt, water from getting into that bearing. So what happens when you over grease a bearing is you can actually press the seal out, allowing water and debris to get into that bearing. All right, so as a bearing's spinning, the seal keeps the grease inside, because if you didn't have a seal and the bearing's spinning really fast, like that, grease has a chance of working its way out, right? So you never want to apply too much grease into a bearing. So now there's a pretty easy formula to figure out how much grease needs to go into a bearing. So you take the outside diameter of the bearing, multiply it by the width of the bearing, and then you multiply that by 0.114. And that'll give you how many grams of grease need to go in a bearing. So typically, if you have a 3-inch bearing, outside diameter, and the width is 1 inch, it's going to take about 1 gram of grease inside. Now, how often you have to supply that gram of grease is going to depend on the recommended interval in the owner's manual, which has to do with heat, running time, running speed, and all that. But so typically, 3-inch bearing, 1 inch wide, takes 1 pump of grease. This bearing is 3/4 of an inch wide, and it's 3 1/4 inches thick. So it's going to take like a 1/4 pump of grease, quarter gram. So it doesn't take a ton. And you might have to grease this bearing every 10 hours or something like that. But you don't want to get too much grease in there and press those seals out. Generally, making sure you have enough grease is important. If you hear, again, using your ears, if you hear that a bearing is running a little bit loud, probably needs more grease. But you got to make sure that you're following that maintenance cycle and going through and greasing those bearings, not over greasing them. Use that formula. You can write right on the bearing, how many pumps or whatever it takes. Typically a lot of maintenance guys, 1 pump on a 3-inch bearing, and then you go up from there. And you have to be as precise as saying like, oh, I need 3/4 of a stroke, something like that. No, I mean, make it simple. A little extra grease in there is going to be okay. We just don't want so much grease that it's pushing out that seal. So that's how much grease should go in a bearing compared to a bushing. And on a bearing, we're going to use a buttery grease or a multi-purpose grease that's a combination of being tacky but also smooth. In a pin and a bushing, we're going to typically use a tackier grease with a heavier base oil so that it holds in place and doesn't get pressed out when that extreme pressure is on that pin. And another little tip, if you're doing a lot of pins and bushings, it doesn't hurt after you grease it to raise that boom up and down and make sure that grease gets worked all the way around. So if you do that a couple of times, that'll make sure that grease gets worked in there. There's going to be lubrication grooves in that pin or in the bushing to help that grease move. But if you grease it and then you don't move a whole lot with your day-to-day task or whatever you're using the machine for, it's possible that you don't get grease worked around, and then you're opening that pin and bushing up to get excess wear or moisture and rusting because that grease isn't all the way around the surface. So typically we always tell our guys, if you're going to go out and grease, after you get done greasing, raise and lower the boom a couple of times, make sure that grease gets worked around.